go elsewhere in the universe at some point in time.
Years ago, we had a deputy program manager named Frank Culbertson. In fact, he flew on board the International Space Station. And in the interim between the Mir space station, that was the Russian space station, and before we put the first humans on board the International Space Station, he said, you know, I have a son, Frank Jr., and during that time he goes, you know, this is the first time in his life that there were no humans permanently in space. Because it's a big deal. Since that time we have humans on board. So kids that were born after 2000, the fall of 2000, have never known a time in their lives when there weren't humans in space. And I hope that that is our future.
My favorite thing is being able to sit with my kids at home on an afternoon or at night in the summer, where you can enjoy the good weather, clear sky, and you sit there and you are talking, and you look at your watch and say, look up there, the station is coming. And they all say, what is that? The station? Yeah, the space station. Now we start talking about it, and they start asking questions of what I do and why am I involved and why they want to be, then they have an interest in learning. So for me the station is a way to unite people, and just sitting around a fire camp and discussing something. But it's a way, we have a bright star that is out there, or that was built by mankind.
There was a kid that I hadn't interacted with directly, but indirectly, by leaving a message on his friend's answering machine when he had broken his leg riding on a BMX bike. And his friend took the tape to school from the answering machine and played it for his friend, RJ, who was reading 2 levels below the grade that he was in. After hearing the tape, after doing a little research and saying that, hey, he's an astronaut, he's a football player, well, I should study harder and be better. And this kid went from reading 2 grade levels below where he should have been within 6 months to reading on his level, and then a few months later above his level. So working in an environment that exposes our next generation of explorers to great people, great wonderful things, allow them to pick themselves up and do better, which in turn picks our civilization up and makes us a better civilization.
We have the ability to talk on the ham radio to kids all over the world, and they have some of the most amazing questions. There was one time when somebody called up and asked me how the nematoids were doing, and I actually had to find out that we had nematoids on board and what they were. They're worms, and the kids in this classroom are watching them grow, but unfortunately we couldn't see them grow. But that's just an example of some of the amazing questions that you get. Another kid asked me how a spider would build its web in space, and I don't know. This is pretty amazing questions that kids ask you. Kids get grossed out a little bit that we don't have a shower up in space, and so when you're up living on the International Space Station, you might be 6 months without a real shower. Essentially you have a sponge bath is what you do every day. And yeah, you do get pretty sweaty because you're working out. But surprisingly enough, when the shuttle crew came to pick me up, was one of my first questions, do I smell? And they said I didn't smell, and they said my hair didn't look greasy, so I was pretty happy with that.
You know, people, always ask me, well, Leland, who are your heroes? And I always tell them it's my parents, because my parents were school teachers who inspired people in my community, got people off of drugs and things that were very negative. And so you never know who is going to be that person that gives you the inspiration and that turns this child from being, doing bad things to maybe being the next astronaut that's going to save someone's life, or the next doctor or scientist or engineer. So as role models, we're all role models. We're just good ones or bad ones. So when people ask me, are you a hero? I say no. A hero is a sandwich, but role models are real.
It's important for us to remind ourselves periodically that the ISS is not an end to itself, but a means to an end. And to fulfill the vision of exploration, to go back to the moon, establish at least a semi-permanent, if not permanent presence there, and then looking ahead for exploration of Mars and elsewhere in the solar system.
Before our flight, or STS-123, we didn't have a Japanese module on the space station. And I think it was hard for the Japanese public to relate themselves to the space station. But now we have a house, a Japanese home up there. And Kibo means hope in Japanese. And I think they can see it as a new hope for space exploration and for themselves as well.
Я думаю, что мы вышли на этап.
I think we are at the verge of an era when not only cosmonauts will have access to space, but scientists and amateurs as well.
Где-то любители, где-то непрофессионалов, которые должны пройти подготовку, но возможности доступа.
Space will be open to mankind.
Возможности доступа человека в космос.
I think way off in the future, when people look back historically at what the ISS accomplished, they will acknowledge that the ISS broke the frontier on how to live and work in space over a long period of time, and to sustain that operation from the ground over a long period of time. And I firmly believe that the ISS is, in part anyway, setting the framework and the foundation to be able to do that for future exploration. I think it'll also be a model historically for international endeavors with up to this time in history that are without comparison in terms of all the complexity and the scope and the magnitude and the depth of that international partnership.
During the first part of space station construction, we were able to have a strong science program. Now that we're finished building the space station, we are going to be able to accomplish the dreams, the initial dreams that we had for everything that we can do by having zero gravity, by having a vibration-free environment, by looking at how flames, how materials, how new protein crystals, all these things will grow in space, and we will get so much more for our science bang for the buck now that we're station complete.
I think the ISS, the International Space Station, just like all of space exploration historically, cannot help but bring great inspiration to young people as they're growing up and looking ahead to the future of their life and what they're going to do. I think that's one of the intangible benefits that we need to acknowledge and remind ourselves of the ISS is the inspiration. Even though young people may not know another time that other than the ISS being on orbit because they're too young, they will become aware of it over time through the study of history. And I think, you know, we emphasize science and engineering and math and all of those topics, and we should, but that's not to diminish the importance of history, to understand where we've come from so that we know where we are, to better envision where we're going.
When we have discussions with anyone about what it is to inspire the younger generation to participate in space travel and exploration, one of the big answers you get often is we need to inspire them so they will study math and engineering. And one of the things the International Space Station, I think, has taught all of us is that it's much, much more than math and science. We need to study math and science, sure, to be good engineers, but we need to be able to communicate. And that means we need to study and understand the English language and how to communicate clearly. And then we find that we're multi-nations. And when you have multiple nations, you have multiple cultures and multiple languages. So language training, a second language or even a third language, which as engineers growing up, we didn't consider that important for our important subjects in school. Today we find it to be very important. It's important to understand cultures and understand other languages. Understanding your own history is very important. Many of us spent time in school learning history, but it was sort of interesting reading, and we sort of understood it, but we sort of forgot it as soon as our tests were over. But today we find history is important to telling us where we've been and where we're going. Very basic exploration things we did to get to the west coast of this country are similar things you have to prepare for in order to travel to Mars. I mean, it's all about logistics and having a vehicle that'll get you there safely, and understanding the risk associated with it. That's in our history, and that's something that kids need to pay very close attention to and learn.
There are children alive today who have never known a second of their life when the International Space Station was not orbiting overhead, occupied by an international crew. And as these children have grown, they've seen that station grow brighter and brighter, and they have regular opportunities each week or every other week to get outside and see it come overhead, and to share that experience in a world that is rapidly uniting. The International Space Station is a model of how that world will come together and solve enormous technical problems. The children all over the planet can see it grow, can read about its progress, and they will come to realize that this is the time when the human species left the planet for good, when we became a spacefaring species. If they've lived their entire lives to date without having all humans back on the planet, and look up and see this project developing overhead, I think that's inspiration enough to say, this is my moment to do something great for mankind.
I hope years from now, when people look back at what we have done, they recognize that we were the Conestoga wagons back then. You know, we were the ones who were slowly going across the prairie. And by the way, these Conestoga wagons had people in them. We did not send the Conestoga wagons across the prairies with just oxen, unmanned. We had people in them, and people solved the problems.
Конечно, с оптимизмом, потому что я считаю, что, понимаете, пилотируемые космонавты...
I look to the future with optimism. You know, the future of manned spaceflight, regardless of all the arguments made against it, because people will keep arguing whether robots can do a better job than people in space. I think that robots and people complement each other.
О том, самое главное, что пилотируемый космос, он постоянно держит как бы...
Manned spaceflight is a very effective factor for maintaining the readiness of the industry to respond to the challenges of space. Because of this, I believe that manned spaceflight has a very bright future.
На этом фоне я считаю, что пилотируемая космонавтика, она имеет очень большую перспективу.
If you look at all the countries that have come together through Europe and us that used to be sometimes politically not such good friends, but now we're all pulling forward and pulling for the same higher goal, it's a tremendous testimony to what we can do as a team if we all work together.
I didn't understand this quote from Kalpana Chawla. At one point in time she had said that she was a citizen of the universe, and I thought, that sounds a little hokey, that sounds a little corny, but I think I didn't understand that until I went to space, because you really sort of, one of the things I've mentioned before is when you're up in space and you look down at the planet, you don't see borders between countries. You really feel like you are from that planet. And that's one impression when you're looking down, but then when you're looking out into space, you feel like our planet is just one of the very, very many small little pieces that are part of the whole universe. And so you sort of feel like even just part of Earth is just a little citizen of our universe. And so I think that's a better description of all of us here. We're just citizens of the universe.
History is full of people planting flags everywhere. We've done it. The settling of the North American continent, anywhere that humans have gone, they've wanted to plant flags. And certainly we carry the flags of many nations aboard the space station. But I think that when people look back at this era of space exploration, they'll realize that's the time that people looked back at the planet and said, I'm from that planet and not from that country. As Carl Sagan said, when we get to Mars, Earth will be a pale blue dot, and you won't really care which side of it you came from. And I think people will remember this program as the first time that the world started to think that way.